The blood on Margaret Vanderhoek's apron was not her own, though she wished desperately it could have been instead of her mother's. She stood in the dusty main street of Fort McDowell, Arizona Territory, in the sweltering August heat of 1883, watching the undertaker's wagon carry away the only family she had left in this world, and felt nothing but a hollow emptiness where her heart should have been. The Apaches had not killed her mother. Disease had not taken her. No accident had befallen her. It was simply a weak heart that finally gave out after years of washing other people's clothes, mending other people's tears, and folding other people's linens to keep a roof over their heads and food on their table. Margaret was 22 years old, alone, and facing a future that looked as barren as the Arizona desert stretching endlessly in every direction. She walked back to the small laundry house her mother had operated for the past 8 years, the only business they had managed to scrape together after her father died in a mining accident back in Colorado. Fort McDowell was a hard place, built up around the military post and serving the soldiers, the ranchers, and the few hardy souls who tried to make something of themselves in this unforgiving land. The laundry house smelled of lye soap and starch, scents that had become as familiar to Margaret as her own skin. She looked around at the baskets of clothes waiting to be washed, the linens that needed pressing, the shirts requiring buttons. Her mother had been meticulous about the work, teaching Margaret from a young age that every crease mattered, every fold should be precise, every garment returned in better condition than received. It was more than washing clothes. It was about dignity, her mother had said. About taking something soiled and making it clean, taking something wrinkled and making it smooth, taking chaos and creating order. Margaret sat down heavily on the wooden stool by the washboard and allowed herself 5 minutes of tears. Just 5 minutes, she told herself, because that was all she could afford. The rent on the laundry house was due in 2 weeks, and she had customers depending on her. She could grieve while she worked, grieve while she survived, but she could not afford to stop moving. When the 5 minutes ended, she wiped her eyes on her sleeve, stood up, and began sorting the laundry. White linens in one pile, colored fabrics in another, delicate items requiring special care in a third. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over where her mind could not quite focus. She built up the fire under the large copper kettle, hauled water from the well out back, and began the familiar rhythm of washing, wringing, and hanging clothes to dry in the brutal afternoon sun. She was hanging sheets on the line stretched across the small yard behind the laundry house when she heard the horse approach. Margaret did not turn around immediately, finishing pinning the corner of the sheet before glancing over her shoulder. A man sat astride a dusty bay horse, his hat pulled low against the sun, wearing the worn canvas pants and faded shirt of a working cowboy. He had a bedroll tied behind his saddle and saddlebags that looked like they carried everything he owned. "Excuse me, miss," the man said, his voice deep but not unkind. "I am looking for the laundry. Mrs. Vanderhoek, I believe. My mother has passed," Margaret said, turning to face him fully. "I am Margaret Vanderhoek. I run the laundry now." The man dismounted in one fluid motion and removed his hat, revealing dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were an unexpected shade of blue-gray, like storm clouds over the desert. He was young, perhaps 26 or 27, with the lean build of someone who spent long days in the saddle and the sun-weathered skin of someone who made his living outdoors. "I am sorry for your loss, Miss Vanderhoek," he said, and something in his tone suggested he knew what loss felt like. "My name is James Xander. I work at the Triple Bar Ranch about 15 miles north of here." The foreman sent me to see about getting our linens and towels washed regular-like, maybe once every 2 weeks. We have got 12 men in the bunkhouse, and the main house needs service too." Margaret's mind immediately began calculating. A ranch that size would mean steady income, reliable work, enough to keep the laundry going and pay the rent. "I can manage that," she said, though she was not entirely certain it was true. "What kind of arrangement were you thinking?" "I could bring the laundry in Monday mornings, pick it up Thursdays," James said. "We would pay fair rates, whatever you think reasonable. The ranch owner, Mr. Samuel Thornton, he wants his operation running smooth, and that means clean linens for the bunkhouse and the main house both." They negotiated terms while standing in the dusty yard, the desert heat pressing down on them like a physical weight. Margaret found herself studying James Xander as they talked, noting the way he met her eyes directly when he spoke, the calloused hands that suggested hard work, the respectful distance he maintained. He was not like some of the men who came to the laundry, the ones who looked at her and her mother like they were something less than human, because they took in washing for a living. "I will have a load ready for you this Thursday," Margaret said finally, "so you can see the quality of the work before committing to regular service." "That seems fair," James agreed. He pulled a small pouch from his pocket and counted out coins. "This should cover the first load and a bit extra as a deposit on future service." Margaret accepted the money, her fingers briefly brushing his palm as she took the coins. She felt calluses there, earned through honest labor, and found something oddly comforting about that. "I will have everything ready Thursday afternoon," she promised. James Xander nodded, put his hat back on, and mounted his horse with the same easy grace he had shown dismounting. "I am sorry again about your mother," he said. "This territory is hard on everyone, but it seems especially hard on good women." He rode away before Margaret could think of a response, leaving her standing in the yard with the coins warm in her hand and a strange flutter in her chest that she could not quite name. She shook her head, dismissing the feeling as nothing more than relief at securing steady work, and went back to hanging laundry. The next 3 days passed in a blur of washing, pressing, folding, and delivering finished laundry to her existing customers around Fort McDowell. Margaret fell into bed each night exhausted, her hands raw from lye soap, her back aching from bending over the washboard. But there was something almost meditative about the work, something that kept her mind occupied so she did not have to think too much about how alone she was now. Thursday arrived hot and cloudless, the kind of day where the sun felt like a hammer beating down on an anvil. Margaret had the Triple Bar Ranch's laundry finished and neatly stacked in a large basket, every piece precisely folded, every corner aligned. She had stayed up late the night before making sure the work was perfect, knowing this first load would determine whether she kept this valuable account. She was folding the last set of towels, her movements automatic but precise, when James Xander walked through the door of the laundry house. She had been expecting him to arrive on horseback, but instead he had come with a wagon, clearly intending to take back a substantial amount of clean laundry. "Miss Vanderhoek," he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. The small space of the laundry house suddenly felt even smaller with his presence in it. "I hope I am not too early." "Your timing is perfect," Margaret said, gesturing to the basket of folded linens. "Everything is ready." James stepped closer to examine the work, and Margaret found herself holding her breath, waiting for his judgment. She watched as he carefully lifted a folded sheet, noting how the edges aligned perfectly, how the creases were sharp and even. He set it down and picked up one of the towels, holding it up to the light streaming through the window, checking for cleanliness and wear. "This is remarkable work," he said finally, looking at her with something like wonder in his gray-blue eyes. "I have never seen linens folded with such precision. Everything is perfect." "My mother taught me that the details matter," Margaret said, feeling an unexpected warmth at his praise. "That even something as simple as folding a towel should be done with care." James set the towel back in the basket, but his eyes stayed on Margaret. "Fold yourself into my life with that same care," he said, so quietly she almost did not hear him. "I beg your pardon," Margaret said, certain she had misheard. James's weathered face colored slightly, and he cleared his throat. "I apologize, Miss Vanderhoek. That was forward of me. I only meant that watching you work, seeing the care you take with something most people consider menial, it made me think that a person who approaches laundry with such dedication must approach everything in life the same way." Margaret felt her own cheeks warming and turned away, busying herself with straightening items that did not need straightening. "You give me too much credit, Mr. Xander. I simply do what needs doing." "That is exactly what I mean," James said. He moved to pick up the heavy basket of laundry, but Margaret noticed him favoring his left side, a slight wince crossing his face as he lifted. "Are you injured?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Nothing serious," James assured her. "A horse threw me a few days back. Just bruised ribs, they will heal." "You should not be lifting heavy loads with bruised ribs," Margaret said firmly. She moved to help him, taking one side of the basket while he took the other. Together they carried it out to the wagon, their movements naturally synchronized despite having just met. As James loaded the basket into the wagon bed, Margaret found herself studying him again, noticing things she had not registered during their first meeting. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the gentle patience in his movements as he secured the load. There was something solid about him, something steady that called to something deep inside her. "Will you bring the next load Monday?" Margaret asked as James prepared to climb up onto the wagon seat. "I will," James confirmed. He paused, one boot on the wagon step, and looked back at her. "Miss Vanderhoek, I hope this is not too bold, but would you allow me to bring you some eggs from the ranch? We have more than we can use, and it seems a waste when there are folks in town who might appreciate them." Margaret knew charity when she heard it, even when it was dressed up in polite words. Part of her wanted to refuse on principle, to maintain her pride and independence. But the practical part of her, the part that had been calculating how to stretch her meager supplies, won out. "That would be kind of you, Mr. Xander. Thank you." "James," he said. "Please call me James." "Then you should call me Margaret," she replied, surprising herself with the offer. James smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his whole face from merely handsome to something that made Margaret's breath catch. "Until Monday then, Margaret." She watched him drive away, the wagon kicking up dust on the road leading north out of town. When he was out of sight, she went back into the laundry house and found herself smiling for the first time since her mother had died. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it was there. The weekend passed with its usual work. Margaret washed clothes for the officers' wives at the fort, pressed shirts for the general store owner, and mended tears for anyone who asked. Sunday she attended church services, sitting in the back pew as she always did, feeling the weight of sympathetic stares from the other women in the congregation. They meant well, she knew, but their pity felt suffocating. After the service, Mrs. Thornton approached her. Margaret had never spoken directly to the ranch owner's wife before, though she had seen her in town on occasion. Mrs. Thornton was a handsome woman in her 50s, dressed in good quality clothes that spoke of money but not ostentation. "Miss Vanderhoek," Mrs. Thornton said warmly, "I wanted to tell you that the laundry work you did for the ranch was exceptional. James brought it back yesterday, and I cannot remember when I have seen linen so beautifully presented. Thank you, Mrs. Thornton, Margaret said, feeling that same warm glow she had experienced when James had praised her work. I am glad you were satisfied. More than satisfied, Mrs. Thornton assured her. In fact, I wanted to ask if you might be interested in taking on some additional work. I have several good dresses that need altering, and I have been told you have a fine hand with a needle. They arranged for Margaret to come out to the ranch the following week to discuss the alterations. As Mrs. Thornton walked away, Margaret felt the first stirrings of hope. Perhaps she could make this work. Perhaps she could build on what her mother had started, could create a real business instead of just barely surviving. Monday morning arrived with clouds building over the mountains to the east, promising rain that might or might not actually fall. Margaret had a batch of bread baking in the small oven in her living quarters behind the laundry house when she heard the wagon outside. She wiped flour from her hands and went to meet James, who was unloading what looked like 2 very full bags of dirty laundry. "Good morning," James called, his face lighting up when he saw her. "I brought the laundry and those eggs I promised." Margaret helped him carry the bags inside, and then James returned to the wagon to retrieve a basket covered with a cloth. When he pulled back the covering, Margaret saw at least 2 dozen eggs nestled in straw, along with a small cloth sack. "The cook also sent coffee," James said, looking slightly embarrassed. "She said she heard Mrs. Vanderhoek had passed and thought you might could use some extras." Again, Margaret felt that conflict between pride and practicality. "Please thank your cook for me," she said, accepting the basket. "That is very kind." "Maria is like that," James said. "She mothers all of us ranch hands whether we want it or not." Margaret invited James to sit for a moment while she packaged up some of the bread she had just baked, insisting he take a loaf back to share with the bunkhouse. They sat at the small table in her living quarters, drinking well water because she was too proud to immediately break into the coffee he had just brought, talking about inconsequential things. The weather, the crops, the rumors that the railroad might extend a spur line toward Fort McDowell. But Margaret found herself watching the way James's hands wrapped around his tin cup, the way he listened when she spoke as if her words actually mattered. There was an easiness between them that felt both strange and comfortable, like putting on a well-worn coat that somehow fit perfectly despite never having worn it before. "I should let you get to work," James said finally, standing and reaching for his hat. "I have kept you long enough." "Monday and Thursday," Margaret said. "Those will be the standing days, if that suits you," James confirmed. He paused at the door, seeming to want to say something more, but ultimately just settled his hat on his head and gave her a small nod. "Until Thursday, then." Over the following weeks, a pattern established itself. James would bring laundry on Monday mornings, always arriving early enough that Margaret would invite him in for coffee and whatever she had baked. They would talk while she sorted the laundry, easy conversations that ranged from serious to silly. He told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to cowboy from his father, about losing his whole family to cholera when he was 19. She told him about Colorado, about her father's death in the mine collapse, about her mother's determination to make a life for them no matter what it took. On Thursdays, James would collect the finished laundry, and these visits stretched longer each week. He began timing his arrivals for late afternoon, when Margaret's main work was done for the day. Sometimes he would help her with chores around the laundry house, fixing a loose board here, adjusting a clothesline there. Margaret found herself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. She was folding linens one Thursday in late September when James arrived. The weather had finally broken. the brutal summer heat giving way to cooler temperatures that made working over the steaming wash kettles more bearable. Margaret had the week's laundry spread across the large work table, sorting and folding with the precision that had become her trademark. James stood in the doorway watching her work, and when Margaret glanced up and caught his expression, something shifted between them. There was hunger in his eyes, but not the crude kind she had learned to recognize and avoid. This was different, deeper, a longing that resonated with something she had been trying to ignore in her own heart. "I cannot stop thinking about what I said that first day," James said, his voice rough. "About folding yourself into my life with the same care you fold these linens." Margaret's hand stilled on the sheet she was folding. "James, I know I have no right," he continued, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "I am just a cowboy with nothing to offer but hard work and uncertain prospects. But Margaret, these past weeks, getting to know you, watching the way you face each day with such strength and grace, I find myself hoping for things I had no business hoping for." "What things?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A home," James said simply. "A partner. Someone to build a life with instead of just surviving day to day. Someone who understands that the small things matter, that taking care with details is not wasted effort, but the foundation everything else is built on." Margaret set down the sheet and walked around the table until she stood directly in front of James. She could smell the clean scent of soap on his skin, the faint, dusty smell of horse and leather that clung to his clothes. "I think about you constantly," she admitted. "When I am working, I am counting the hours until Monday or Thursday. When you are here, I am dreading the moment you will leave. I have been telling myself it is only gratitude for the work, for the kindness you have shown me. But that is not true, is it?" "No," James said. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and cupped her face in his calloused palm. "It is not gratitude I feel when I look at you, Margaret. It is not kindness that makes my heart race when I turn onto this street. It is not friendship that has me lying awake nights thinking about your smile." "Then what is it?" Margaret asked, though she knew, had known perhaps from that very first day when he had watched her fold linens and said those words that had burrowed into her heart. "Love," James said. "I am falling in love with you, Margaret Vanderhoek. Maybe I have been since the moment I saw you hanging sheets in your yard, facing down grief and hardship with your shoulders straight and your chin up." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not sad tears. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I have been so frightened to admit it, even to myself." James bent his head slowly, and Margaret rose on her toes to meet him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. His lips were warm and slightly chapped from the sun, and Margaret felt something inside her unfurl like a flower opening to light. When they parted, both were breathing hard, and James rested his forehead against hers. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I want to do this right, Margaret." "You deserve that." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "I would like that very much." They stood there together in the laundry house, surrounded by the clean scent of soap and starch, holding each other as the afternoon light slanted through the windows and painted everything gold. Margaret felt her mother's presence in that moment, a gentle blessing, an acknowledgement that it was all right to move forward, to choose life and love and hope. Over the following months, James courted Margaret with a steadiness and devotion that made her certain of his feelings. He came to Fort McDowell every Sunday to escort her to church, enduring the knowing looks and whispered comments of the other townspeople. He brought small gifts that showed he paid attention to her words. A new pair of sturdy work gloves when he noticed hers were worn through, a length of pretty calico fabric in a blue that matched her eyes, a book of poetry because she had mentioned loving to read when she had the time. Margaret met his world too, visiting the Triple Bar Ranch to do the alteration work for Mrs. Thornton and staying for dinner afterward. She met the other cowboys who worked with James, saw the respect they had for him, the way the foreman relied on his judgment and experience. She met Maria, the cook, who immediately pulled Margaret into a warm embrace and declared she was perfect for James. She saw the small room James occupied in the bunkhouse, the few possessions he owned all kept neat and orderly, and understood that he was a man who valued the same things she did. In November, the first real cold snap hit Fort McDowell, bringing frost that killed the last struggling plants in Margaret's small garden and sent everyone scrambling for warmer clothes. James arrived one Monday morning with the laundry and a serious expression that made Margaret's heart clench with worry. "What is wrong?" she asked immediately. "Nothing is wrong," James assured her quickly. He pulled an envelope from his inside coat pocket and handed it to her. "I have been saving since before I met you, putting aside every spare cent I could. It is not much, but it is enough." Margaret opened the envelope with shaking hands and found herself looking at a deed. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading, and when she did, she looked up at James in shock. "This is for a parcel of land. 20 acres about 3 miles north of town," James confirmed. "Good water, some timber, enough grazing for a few head of cattle and some horses. There is no house on it yet, no buildings at all. But I spoke with Mr. Thornton, and he has agreed to let me work half days through the winter so I can spend the rest of the time building. Come spring, there will be a house there. Nothing fancy, but solid and weatherproof with room enough for a family." Margaret felt tears spilling down her cheeks, and James immediately looked distressed. "If it is too soon, if you are not ready, I understand," he said quickly. "I can wait, Margaret. I will wait as long as you need." "You fool," Margaret said, laughing and crying at the same time. "These are happy tears. Yes, James. Yes to everything you are asking." James whooped and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the laundry house while Margaret clung to his shoulders and laughed. When he set her down, he kissed her with a thoroughness that left them both dizzy, and then he pulled a small box from another pocket. "This was my grandmother's," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small garnet stone. "It is the only thing of my mother's I managed to keep. I know it is not much." "It is perfect," Margaret interrupted, holding out her left hand. James slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit as if it had been made for her. They stood together looking at her hand, both of them grinning like fools, until the practical side of Margaret's nature reasserted itself. "We should marry soon," she said, "before winter sets in fully, and I will need to figure out what to do with the laundry house." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Fort McDowell, with Mrs. Thornton standing as Margaret's witness and the ranch foreman standing for James. Maria from the ranch brought food for a small celebration afterward, and half the town turned out despite the cold weather, curious to see the laundry woman marry the cowboy. Margaret wore her best dress, dark blue wool with a white lace collar she had painstakingly made herself, and carried a small bouquet of dried flowers that Mrs. Thornton had insisted she have. James wore new trousers and a new shirt, his boots polished to a high shine, his hair neatly trimmed. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her with a tenderness that made Margaret's heart swell, until she thought it might burst. They spent their wedding night in Margaret's small living quarters behind the laundry house, the only private space they had. It was awkward and sweet and tender. Two people learning each other, discovering the miracle of physical intimacy within the safety of commitment and love. Afterward, they lay tangled together in Margaret's narrow bed, talking in whispers about the future they would build together. "I am frightened," Margaret admitted in the darkness. "Everything is changing so fast." "I know," James said, his arms tightening around her. "But we will face it together. You do not have to be strong alone anymore, Margaret. I am here and I am not going anywhere." "Promise me," Margaret whispered. "I promise," James said solemnly. "For better or worse, in plenty and in want, in sickness and in health, as long as we both shall live." I meant every word, Margaret. She believed him. More than that, she trusted him, trusted the steady devotion she saw in his eyes every time he looked at her, trusted the care he took with everything he did. They were alike in that way, she realized. Both of them understood that love was not just grand gestures and passionate declarations. It was showing up day after day. It was taking care with the small things. It was folding linens with precision and building a house with solid joints and making promises you intended to keep. Through the winter, they lived in Margaret's quarters while James worked on building their house. He would leave before dawn to put in half a day's work at the triple bar, then spend the afternoon hauling timber, digging foundations, and slowly raising walls. Margaret continued running the laundry, though she had to turn away some customers because she could not manage the volume alone that she and her mother had handled together. On the weekends, Margaret would bundle up against the cold and ride out to the property with James, bringing food and spending the day helping however she could. She learned to mix mortar and hand tools, to steady boards while James hammered nails, to think about spaces in terms of function and efficiency. They planned together where the kitchen would go, where the bedroom would be, where they would eventually add a second room when children came. It was hard work, exhausting and sometimes frustrating when the winter weather would not cooperate or when mistakes had to be torn down and rebuilt correctly. But there was also something deeply satisfying about it, about creating something from nothing, about seeing the tangible results of their combined effort rising up out of the earth. In February, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but waited to be certain before telling James. When she finally did, over breakfast on a Sunday morning, James went very still and then very carefully set down his coffee cup. "A baby," he said, his voice strange. "Yes," Margaret confirmed, suddenly worried by his reaction. "Are you not pleased?" James looked at her and she saw his eyes were wet with tears. "Pleased, Margaret, I am more than pleased. I am overwhelmed. I am terrified. I am the happiest I have ever been in my entire life." He came around the table and dropped to his knees beside her chair, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing his face against her stomach. "A baby," he whispered. "We are going to have a baby." Margaret ran her fingers through his hair, feeling her own tears start. They had both lost so much, both been alone for so long. And now they were creating a family, building something that would last beyond themselves, putting down roots in this hard land and choosing to believe in a future. By late March, the house was finished enough to move into, though there was still trim work to complete and 100 small details that would take months to finish properly. It was a simple rectangular structure, one large main room that served as kitchen and living area, a bedroom partitioned off with a real door, and a loft space accessible by a ladder where they could store things and eventually turn into sleeping space for children. Margaret sold the laundry business to a widow who had recently arrived in Fort McDowell, a woman with 2 teenage daughters who could help with the work. The money from the sale was not much, but it was enough to buy a good cook stove, a proper bed frame, and fabric for curtains and bedding. Margaret kept one thing from the laundry house, the large work table where she had folded so many linens, where James had first told her to fold herself into his life with care. They brought it to the new house and set it in the kitchen, and Margaret used it for everything from kneading bread to cutting out fabric for the baby clothes she was sewing. James went back to full-time work at the Triple Bar, and Margaret focused on making their house into a home. She planted a garden in the rich soil near the creek that ran through their property, sewed curtains and quilts and baby gowns, put up preserves and pickles, and anything else she could manage to grow or trade for. Their nearest neighbors were almost 2 miles away, but Margaret did not mind the isolation. After years of living in town, surrounded by people and noise and the constant press of other people's business, the quiet of their land felt like a blessing. On a warm evening in early September of 1884, Margaret went into labor. James had been watching her anxiously for days, and when the pain started, he immediately rode for the doctor in Fort McDowell. But babies come in their own time, and by the time James returned with the doctor, Margaret had already delivered their son with only Maria, who had insisted on staying with them for the last week, to assist. James burst into the bedroom, wild-eyed and terrified, to find Margaret propped up against pillows, exhausted but smiling, holding a squalling red-faced infant. "A boy," Margaret said tiredly. "We have a son, James." James approached slowly, reverently, and when Margaret placed the baby in his arms, she watched her strong cowboy husband break down in tears. He held their son so carefully, as if he were made of spun glass, and looked at Margaret with such love and gratitude that she felt her heart might actually break from the fullness of it. "What should we name him?" James asked. They had discussed names but never quite settled on one. Margaret looked at her husband holding their child, thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, thought about her mother who would never meet this grandchild but whose teachings had led Margaret to the man who would be such a wonderful father. "Thomas," she said. "After your father, Thomas Michael, if you approve of giving him my father's name as well." "Thomas Michael Xander," James said, testing the name. He looked down at the baby, who had stopped crying and was now staring up at James with dark blue eyes. "Welcome to the world, Thomas. You have no idea how loved you are already." The doctor checked them both over, pronounced mother and baby healthy, and left with instructions and the promise to return in a few days. Maria prepared food and fussed over all of them, before finally being persuaded to return to the ranch. And then it was just the three of them, James and Margaret and their son, a family. Those first months of Thomas's life were exhausting and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Margaret had helped her mother with neighbors' babies and thought she knew what to expect, but nothing quite prepared her for the reality of being completely responsible for this tiny human. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong, but he still needed constant care, constant attention. James was a revelation as a father. He would come home from long days working cattle and immediately reach for his son, walking him around the house when he was fussy, singing silly songs, talking to him about everything and nothing. On Sundays, their only full day together as a family, James would insist Margaret rest while he handled Thomas, changing soiled cloths without complaint and rocking the baby to sleep against his broad chest. "You are so good with him," Margaret said one Sunday afternoon, watching James play with 6-month-old Thomas on a quilt spread in the shade of the cottonwood tree near their house. "I never thought I would have this," James admitted, dangling a toy horse where Thomas could bat at it with his chubby hands. "After I lost my family, I figured I was destined to be alone, and then you came into my life, folding linens with such care, and everything changed." "We both lost so much," Margaret said softly, "but we found each other, and now we have this beautiful life we built together." Thomas chose that moment to grab the toy horse and immediately try to shove it in his mouth. James laughed and gently redirected him, and Margaret felt such a surge of contentment that she had to close her eyes against the intensity of it. The years passed, with the steady rhythm of ranch life. James continued working for the Triple Bar, eventually becoming the foreman when the previous one retired. The promotion came with better pay and a bit of land adjacent to their own property that Mr. Thornton sold them at a good price. They expanded their house, adding 2 more bedrooms and a proper dining room, turning the loft into a sleeping space for ranch hands during particularly busy seasons. Thomas grew from baby to toddler to a sturdy little boy with his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. When he was 3, Margaret gave birth to twin girls, Anna and Grace, who immediately had their father wrapped around their tiny fingers. 2 years after that came another son, Samuel, named for Mr. Thornton, who had been so instrumental in helping James and Margaret build their life. Margaret no longer took in laundry, but she still folded linens with the same precision she always had, teaching her daughters the same lessons her mother had taught her. That details mattered. That taking care with small things was not wasted effort. That creating order from chaos was its own kind of art. James expanded their cattle operation slowly and carefully, never overreaching, always building on solid foundations. They were never rich, but they were comfortable, their children well fed and well clothed, their house warm in winter and cool in summer. They became known throughout the territory as people of integrity, people whose word meant something, people who took care with everything they did. On their 10th anniversary, James brought Margaret back to the laundry house in Fort McDowell. It had changed hands twice since Margaret sold it and was now a millinery shop, but the current owner had known Margaret's mother and was happy to let them step inside for a moment. The space looked completely different, filled with hat boxes and ribbons instead of washboards and soap, but Margaret could still see it as it had been. She could still see herself standing at the work table, folding linens with precision while her heart broke with loss. She could still see James standing in the doorway watching her, saying words that had changed everything. "You regret it?" James asked quietly. "Giving up the business? Your independence?" "I did not give up my independence," Margaret said firmly. "I chose partnership, I chose love. I chose to fold myself into your life, and you into mine, with the same care I took with those linens. And it was the best choice I ever made." James pulled her close, and they stood together in the space where their story had begun, remembering. When Thomas was 12, old enough to be trusted with real responsibility, he began working alongside his father on the ranch. Margaret watched her son grow into a young man who had his father's steadiness and his mother's attention to detail, and felt grateful beyond words. Anna and Grace were 10, bright and curious girls who had their mother's way with a needle and their father's love of horses. Samuel was 8, all energy and mischief and joy. The Arizona Territory was changing too. More people arriving every year, more towns springing up, the railroad finally extending lines that connected Fort McDowell to the wider world. The worst of the violence that had marked the early years of settlement was fading, though it was still a hard land that demanded hard work and offered no guarantees. Margaret was hanging sheets one spring morning in 1896, her movements still precise after all these years, when she felt James's arms come around her from behind. She leaned back against his chest, comfortable with the familiar weight and warmth of him. "Do you remember the first time I saw you hanging sheets?" James asked. "You were on your bay horse, looking dusty and disreputable," Margaret teased. "I fell in love with you in that moment," James said seriously. "Watching you take something ordinary and do it with such care and attention. I knew you were special, Margaret. I knew I wanted to spend my life with you." And have I lived up to your expectations? Margaret asked, turning in his arms to face him. James looked at her, his gray-blue eyes filled with the same love she saw every day, the same devotion that had never wavered in 13 years of marriage. You have exceeded them in every possible way, he said. You have given me a home, a family, a purpose. You have shown me every single day what it means to approach life with care and intention. You have made me better than I ever thought I could be. You did the same for me, Margaret said, reaching up to cup his weathered face. You saw me when I thought I was invisible. You valued what I did when everyone else dismissed it as menial labor. You asked me to fold myself into your life, and then you folded yourself just as carefully into mine. They kissed there in the yard, surrounded by sheets flapping in the spring breeze, the sound of their children playing nearby. The ranch spread around them that they had built together from nothing but hard work and hope and love. That evening, the whole family gathered around the dinner table as they did every night. Thomas sat tall and straight, already looking like a younger version of his father. Anna and Grace kept stealing bites from each other's plates when they thought no one was looking. Samuel was chattering about a foal that had been born that morning, his words tumbling over each other in excitement. Margaret looked around the table at these faces she loved more than anything, at the life she had somehow managed to build from the ashes of loss and loneliness. She thought about her mother, who had taught her the value of precision and care. She thought about her father, who had worked himself to death trying to provide for them. She hoped they could see her now, could see that their sacrifices had not been in vain. After dinner, after the children were in bed, Margaret and James sat on the porch watching the sun set over the desert. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink and purple, the air finally cooling after another hot day. "Tell me about our future," Margaret said, lacing her fingers through James's. "Well," James said thoughtfully, "Thomas will take over the ranch operation in a few more years when he is ready. Anna will probably marry that Shaw boy who keeps finding excuses to ride over here. Grace will become a teacher, I think, because she has always loved books more than anything. And Samuel will either become the governor of Arizona or get himself into trouble. I have not quite figured out which yet." Margaret laughed. "And us? What about us?" "We will grow old together," James said simply. "We will watch our children have children of their own. We will sit on this porch when we are 80 and marvel at how fast it all went. And every single day between now and then, I will love you more than I did the day before." "That is a good future," Margaret said softly. "The best one I could imagine," James agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, and the stars began to appear overhead, countless points of light in the vast desert sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The night breeze rustled through the cottonwood trees. Inside the house, their children slept safe and warm. Margaret thought about that day in August of 1883, when she had stood in the dusty street of Fort McDowell, watching her mother being carried away, feeling like her life was over before it had truly begun. She thought about how wrong she had been, how she could not have imagined then that such joy was possible, that such love existed. She thought about James walking through the door of the laundry house, watching her fold linens, asking her to fold herself into his life with that same care. And she thought about how she had done exactly that, how they had both approached their marriage and their family with the same attention to detail, the same dedication to doing things right, the same understanding that the small things mattered most. "Thank you," Margaret said suddenly. "For what?" James asked. "For seeing me," Margaret said. "For valuing what I did. For understanding that precision and care in small things reflects how a person approaches everything in life. For asking me to share your life. for folding yourself into mine with the same devotion I tried to give to you." "Margaret," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "you have nothing to thank me for. Loving you, building this life with you, it has been the greatest privilege of my existence. I am the one who should be thanking you every single day for choosing me." "We chose each other," Margaret said. "And we keep choosing each other every day through all the hard times and the good times. That is what matters." As the years continued to pass, the Xander ranch prospered. Thomas married a good woman named Rebecca, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and they gave Margaret and James their first grandchildren, 2 boys and a girl who ran wild around the ranch, just as their father had done. Anna did marry the Shaw boy, William, and they moved to Phoenix, where he worked for a law firm, and she became known for her charitable work. Grace became a teacher, just as James had predicted, eventually becoming the principal of the school in Fort McDowell. Samuel turned out to be neither governor nor troublemaker, but a horse trainer of considerable skill, traveling the territory and eventually as far as California, working with difficult horses. Margaret and James watched their children grow and thrive, watched their grandchildren multiply, watched the Arizona Territory become the state of Arizona in 1912. They faced hardships too, the droughts and hard winters, the death of friends, the inevitable losses that come with living a long life. But they faced it all together, with the same partnership they had forged over folded linens in a laundry house so many years before. On a warm October evening in 1918, James and Margaret sat on their porch as they had done countless times over 35 years of marriage. They were both in their 60s now, their hair gray, their hands marked with the work of decades. But James still looked at Margaret with the same love he had shown as a young cowboy, and Margaret still felt her heart skip when she saw him. "Tell me the story," their youngest granddaughter, 10-year-old Rose, begged. She was curled up between them on the porch swing, wrapped in a quilt against the evening chill. "Which story?" James asked, though he knew perfectly well which one she meant. "How you fell in love," Rose said. "The laundry story." Margaret and James exchanged a smile. They had told this story dozens of times to their children and grandchildren, but it never got old. It was their story, the foundation everything else was built on. "Well," Margaret began, "it was a very sad time for me. My mother had just died, and I was all alone in the world trying to figure out how to keep going. And then Grandpa came," Rose prompted, knowing the story by heart but wanting to hear it anyway. "And then I came," James agreed. "I rode into Fort McDowell looking for someone to do laundry for the ranch, and I found your grandmother hanging sheets in her yard with her shoulders straight and her chin up, facing down her grief with such courage." "Tell the part about the linens," Rose insisted. "I watched her fold linens," James continued, his eyes on Margaret's face. "Every corner precisely aligned, every crease exactly where it should be. And I thought that a woman who took such care with something as simple as laundry must be someone very special indeed." "And what did you say?" Rose asked, even though she knew. "I said, fold yourself into my life with that same care," James recited, "and I thank God every day that she did." "It was the best decision I ever made," Margaret added, taking James's hand and squeezing it gently. "Saying yes to your grandfather, building this life together, creating our family. All of it started with folded linens and a cowboy who understood that the small things matter most." Rose sighed happily, satisfied with the familiar story. She stayed with them a while longer, and then her mother called her inside for bed. The house was full of family this weekend. 3 generations gathered for Thomas and Rebecca's 20th anniversary. When they were alone again, Margaret leaned her head on James's shoulder. "We did all right, didn't we?" "Better than all right," James said. We did exactly what we set out to do. We built something solid and good, something that will last beyond us. Our children are happy and healthy. Our grandchildren are growing strong. The ranch is thriving. We have a good life, Margaret. We have a wonderful life, Margaret corrected. And it is all because of the care we have taken with it, with each other, with our family. Just like folding linens, every small choice mattered, every small effort added up to something beautiful. They sat together as the night deepened, warm under the quilt that Margaret had sewn with her own hands from scraps of fabric collected over decades. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of their family, voices raised in laughter and conversation, children running through the rooms, dishes clattering as the evening meal was cleaned up. "I would not change anything," James said suddenly. "If I could go back and live my life over, I would make all the same choices. I would walk through that laundry house door. I would watch you fold those linens. I would fall in love with you all over again." "Even the hard parts?" Margaret asked. "The droughts and the failed crops and the times we barely had enough. Especially the hard parts," James said firmly. "Because we faced them together, and they made us stronger. They taught us what mattered and what did not. They proved that what we built was solid enough to withstand storms." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything they had lived through, everything they had created together. "I love you, James Xander," she said finally. "I loved you when you were a young cowboy with nothing but hope and determination. I loved you when we were struggling to build our house and start our family. I love you now, sitting here with gray in your hair and grandchildren in your house. And I will love you until my last breath and beyond." James turned to her, and even in the darkness she could see the glitter of tears in his eyes. "I love you too, Margaret. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. The absolute best thing." They kissed, a soft, gentle kiss that held 35 years of love and partnership and devotion. And then they sat together watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to the sounds of their family, grateful beyond measure for the life they had built from nothing but hard work and hope and careful attention to the small things that mattered most. Years later, after Margaret and James had both passed peacefully in their sleep within months of each other, their children and grandchildren gathered to go through the house they had built together. They found the old work table from the laundry house, still sturdy after 50 years of use. They found boxes of letters James had written to Margaret during the times he had to be away. They found the quilt Margaret had been working on, a pattern of intricate folds that somehow reminded everyone of neatly folded linens. And they found a journal that Margaret had kept, starting from that first day she met James and continuing until just weeks before her death. The final entry, written in her increasingly shaky hand, read simply, "I folded myself into his life with care, and he folded himself into mine with the same devotion. Together we created something beautiful, something that will outlast us both." The laundry woman and the cowboy built a legacy of love, and I could not ask for anything more. Rose, now a young woman of 20 preparing to marry her own cowboy, read these words aloud to her siblings and cousins. They all stood in the house their grandparents had built, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, a love story that had started with folded linens and grown into something extraordinary. "We should remember this," Rose said. "Remember that Grandma and Grandpa taught us to take care with the small things, to approach everything with precision and devotion. That is how you build something that lasts." And so the story was passed down through generations. The tale of the laundry woman who folded linens with precision, and the cowboy who asked her to fold herself into his life with that same care. It became a family legend, a reminder that love was not just grand gestures but daily choices, Not just passionate declarations, but steady devotion. Not just lucky chance, but careful attention to the things that mattered most. The ranch continued under the stewardship of Thomas, and then his children, and then their children, each generation adding their own chapters to the story, but never forgetting the foundation Margaret and James had laid. The old work table became a treasured heirloom, passed down to each eldest daughter along with the story of how two lonely people had found each other in a dusty Arizona town and built a love that changed everything. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the desert wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, family members swore they could feel the presence of Margaret and James, still together, still watching over the legacy they had created, still demonstrating through their eternal devotion that taking care with the small things really was the foundation on which everything else was built. Their story had started with folded linens and a cowboy's heartfelt words, and it had grown into something that would last forever, a testament to the power of love approached with precision, care, and unwavering commitment.